You know what's funny? Nobody ever teaches you how to be respected. They teach you how to be good, how to share, how to say sorry even when you're not wrong, how to make people comfortable, how to shrink just enough so nobody feels threatened by you. And you did all of it. Every single thing they asked. You were patient when you should have walked away. You were understanding when you deserved an apology. You kept showing up for people who never once looked back to check if you were still standing. And yet, somewhere between all that goodness, something started to rot inside you. Not dramatically, not in a way you could point to. Just this quiet, creeping feeling that no matter how much you gave, no matter how available you made yourself, no matter how many times you put your own needs last, people still treated you like an option. And that confusion, that specific pain of doing everything right and still being overlooked, that is what nobody prepared you for. Here's what actually happened. You didn't lose people's respect because you were weak. You lost it because you taught them, slowly, repeatedly, without even realizing it, that they didn't have to earn your presence, that you'd stay regardless, that your boundaries were suggestions, that your silence meant consent. You made yourself so easy to have that you became impossible to value. Machiavelli, a man who studied human nature with the kind of cold, unflinching honesty that made kings uncomfortable, wrote something that has lived in the bones of every powerful person who ever walked this earth. He said, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Not feared like a tyrant, not feared like something dangerous, feared like a storm, feared like depth, feared like someone who knows exactly what they're worth and will not negotiate that number down for anyone's comfort." That's the kind of person people don't play with. Not because they hate them, but because something in their gut tells them, this one is different. This one doesn't need me. This one will actually leave. And that single shift in energy changes everything. This video is not a self-help checklist. This is not 5 tips to be more confident. This is a mirror. And some of what you see in it is going to be uncomfortable. Because the truth about why people stop respecting you, it doesn't live in them. It lives in the patterns you keep repeating, the silences you keep choosing, the version of yourself you keep shrinking into so that someone else can feel big. 6 points, 6 brutal, real, deeply human truths about what it actually takes to stop being liked and start being respected. Not admired from a distance, not tolerated out of politeness, respected. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Drop this in the comments. I choose respect. Now let's get into it. Point 1. You stopped having standards and called it love. There was a version of you, before all of this, who had lines they wouldn't cross, things they wouldn't accept. A quiet inner knowing that said this isn't right and actually meant it. And then someone came along, or a situation came along, and crossing that line felt easier than losing what you had. So you crossed it, just once, and nothing catastrophic happened, and so the line moved, and then it moved again and again. Until one day you looked around and realized you were standing somewhere so far from yourself that you couldn't even remember what you used to stand for. That's not love. That's not loyalty. That's erosion. And the devastating part is, you called it being understanding. You called it being the bigger person. You wrapped your surrender in the language of virtue so you wouldn't have to feel the weight of what you were actually doing, which was abandoning yourself piece by piece to keep someone else comfortable in your presence. People don't respect that. They can't. Not because they're evil, but because something in human nature, something ancient and instinctive, loses regard for what requires nothing from them. We are wired to value what has weight, what has edges, what pushes back. Machiavelli saw this in every court, every kingdom, every relationship between power and the people who surrendered to it. He wrote, "Men are so simple and so much inclined to obey immediate necessity that a deceiver will never lack victims. You became the victim of your own need to be accepted. Your standards were the first casualty, and here's the part that will really settle heavy in your chest. The people who walked all over those standards, they didn't respect you more for it. They respected you less. And somewhere underneath their comfort, they were quietly waiting for you to finally say enough, waiting to see if you had it in you, and every time you didn't, a little more of their regard for you quietly died. Standards are not walls you build to keep people out. They are the ground you stand on. And when you give that ground away, you are not being loving, you are disappearing, and nobody respects a ghost." Point 2. You were so afraid of losing people that you lost yourself first. Somewhere along the way you developed this terror, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that lives just underneath everything, this constant humming fear that if you're too honest, too direct, too much yourself, people will leave. And so you edited yourself before you even opened your mouth. You pre-adjusted your opinions based on who was in the room. You felt the truth rising in your throat and swallowed it back down because the timing wasn't right, because they were already stressed, because you didn't want to start something. And you did this so many times, for so long, that you genuinely started to forget what your unfiltered self even sounded like. That's not being considerate. That is a slow, quiet disappearance. And the most painful part of that disappearance is that nobody notices it happening, including you, until one day you're sitting in a room full of people who supposedly know you, and you feel completely, utterly alone. Because none of them know you. They know the version of you that survived around them, the edited version, the safe version, the version that laughed at the right moments and never asked for too much and always found a way to make their comfort more important than your truth. Machiavelli understood what happens to people who govern through fear of abandonment rather than through the strength of their own conviction. He wrote, "The one who adapts his policy to the times prospers, and likewise, the one whose policy clashes with the demands of the times does not." But he was not speaking of abandoning yourself. He was speaking of being so deeply rooted in who you are that you can move through any environment without losing your core. That is adaptability from strength. What most people do is adaptation from fear. And those two things produce completely opposite results in how the world treats you. When you move through life terrified of losing people, people feel that fear, and they use it. Not always consciously, but they use it. Because your fear of losing them gives them power over you that they never had to earn. Stop being afraid of the leaving. Some people are supposed to leave, and their leaving is not the tragedy you've convinced yourself it is. Sometimes it's the door opening. Point 3. Silence isn't peace. It's a debt you keep paying with your soul. You stayed quiet. Again. Not because you had nothing to say. You had everything to say. The words were right there, fully formed, burning at the back of your throat. But you looked at their face, calculated the reaction, weighed the cost of the conversation that would follow. And you decided it wasn't worth it. So you swallowed it, smiled through it, maybe even convinced yourself that letting it go was the mature thing to do. But here's what you never accounted for, that swallowed words don't disappear. They don't dissolve. They sit inside you, layer by layer, compressing into something heavier and darker over time. And one day, not because of something huge, but because of something devastatingly small and ordinary, all of it comes out at once. And suddenly, you're the one who overreacted. You're the one who's unstable. You're the one who came out of nowhere. Nobody saw the months of silence that preceded that moment. Nobody counted the number of times you held yourself back. Nobody felt the weight of all those words you buried to keep the peace. They just saw the explosion, and they used it to rewrite your entire character. That is the violence of enforced silence. And you did it to yourself willingly, repeatedly, in the name of being easy to love. Machiavelli watched this pattern destroy rulers, relationships, and men of tremendous potential. He wrote, "Wounds inflicted by necessity are forgiven. Wounds inflicted by choice are not. Every time you chose silence over truth, you wounded yourself by choice. And unlike wounds others give you, the wounds you give yourself are the ones that fester longest. Because there's no one to blame, no one to confront, just you and the echo of everything you should have said, living rent-free in your mind at 3 in the morning. Silence in the face of disrespect is not grace. It is permission. It is you handing someone a signed document that says, "You can do this again. I will absorb it. I will say nothing." And they will, because you told them they could. Your voice is not a weapon. It is not aggression. It is not too much. It is the most fundamental declaration of your existence. And when you silence it, you don't keep the peace. You just postpone the war inside yourself. Point 4. People don't disrespect the ones who scare them a little. Not scare like violence, not scare like unpredictability. Let me be precise about this because it matters. There is a specific kind of person that people instinctively handle with care. You've met them. You know exactly who they are. They're not louder than everyone else. They're not meaner. They don't carry themselves with arrogance or walk around announcing their worth. But something about them stops people from playing games with them. Something about their presence communicates, without a single word, that there are consequences here, that this person knows what they deserve, that this person will not be managed, manipulated, or quietly disrespected and stay around to absorb it. And you have spent your entire life watching those people get the respect that should have been yours. Here's why they have it, and you don't. It's not charisma. It's not dominance. It's not some personality trait you were either born with or not. It is something far simpler and far more devastating in its simplicity. They decided. They made a decision at some point after some experience that cost them enough, that they would never again make themselves smaller for someone else's comfort. That their time had value. That their energy was not a renewable resource available to anyone who asked. That their presence in someone's life was a privilege, not a guarantee, and that privilege could be revoked. That decision changed how they carried themselves. And the world responded accordingly. Because the world, people, they are extraordinarily sensitive to energy in a way they can't always articulate. They don't consciously think, this person has decided they won't be disrespected. They just feel it. In the way someone holds eye contact a beat longer than comfortable. In the way they don't rush to fill silences with reassurance. In the way they can hear something that upsets them and go completely, devastatingly calm instead of immediately trying to smooth it over. That stillness, that quiet, unshaking stillness, is the most powerful thing a human being can possess. Machiavelli studied this quality in the greatest leaders of his era, and distilled it into something that reads like a warning even now. Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception. But never mistake the need for strategy as weakness. The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. Be the fox. Be the lion. Know when to move in silence and when to stand immovably still. The people who get walked over are neither. They are endlessly available, endlessly explaining themselves, endlessly trying to make others understand their worth through words, not through the quiet, unshakable way they live. You cannot talk someone into respecting you. You cannot explain your way into being valued. You cannot be nice enough, patient enough, or understanding enough to manufacture respect in someone who has learned they don't have to give it to you. You earn it by becoming someone that even the most oblivious, self-absorbed person in the room senses, on a level below conscious thought, that they should not test, and that becoming starts not with what you do. It starts with what you finally stop tolerating. Point 5. The moment you stopped needing their approval was the moment you became dangerous. There is a specific moment, and if you've ever experienced it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not a loud moment. It doesn't arrive with music or revelation or some dramatic turning point. It arrives quietly, almost boringly. You're in the middle of some ordinary situation, waiting for a text back, replaying a conversation, contorting yourself trying to figure out what you did wrong this time. And then something just stops, not breaks, not snaps, stops, like a machine that has been running so long on someone else's fuel that it finally completely runs out. And in that silence, that sudden, unfamiliar silence where the anxiety used to live, something else moves in, something that feels dangerously close to indifference. And for a moment, you think something is wrong with you, because you've been so conditioned to need their reaction, their validation, their approval, that the absence of that need feels like loss. It feels like coldness. It feels like you've become someone you're not supposed to be. But you haven't become cold. You've become free. And freedom, to people who were counting on your need, looks absolutely terrifying, because your need was their power. Your desperate, aching desire to be liked, approved of, chosen, that was the leash. And the second you don't need it anymore, the leash drops. And suddenly they have nothing. No leverage, no control, no way to manage you through the threat of withdrawal. And watch what happens in that moment. Watch how fast the dynamic shifts. Watch how the person who barely acknowledged your existence suddenly finds reasons to be around you. Watch how the one who took you for granted starts paying attention. Watch how the room changes when you walk into it no longer searching for someone to validate your presence there. This is not manipulation. This is not a game you play. This is simply what happens when a person stops leaking their worth through the cracks of other people's opinions. Machiavelli wrote something that most people dismiss as cynical, but is actually one of the most liberating observations about human nature ever recorded. Men in general judge more by their eyes than by their hands, because seeing is given to everyone, but touching to few. What people see in you, the image you project through the way you carry yourself, the way you respond, the way you move through the world, that is what they judge you by. Not your intentions, not your depth, not the beautiful, complicated, worthy person you are on the inside that they never bothered to truly know. What they see. And when what they see is someone who is complete without them, someone who is not waiting, not hoping, not quietly auditioning for a permanent place in their life. They see something they cannot easily categorize or dismiss. They see someone who has something they want. Wholeness, the specific, magnetic, utterly ungovernable quality of a person who has stopped measuring their worth through external confirmation and started living from something internal and unshakable. You don't build that by being more likable. You build it by burning the version of yourself that needed to be liked in the first place. And from those ashes, something rises that the world will not be able to ignore. Point 6. Respect is not given to those who ask for it. It's taken by those who embody it. You've asked for respect before. Maybe not with those exact words, but you've asked. You asked when you over-explained yourself, hoping someone would finally understand your worth. You asked when you listed everything you've done, everything you've given, every sacrifice you made, laying it out like evidence in a trial, waiting for the verdict to come back in your favor. You asked when you stayed longer than you should have, hoping that your loyalty would eventually be recognized. When you made yourself undeniably useful, thinking that indispensability would translate into regard. And still, it didn't come. Or it came in scraps. Enough to keep you reaching, but never enough to make you feel truly, solidly valued. Because that is not how respect works. Respect is not a response to a request. It is a response to a reality. The reality of who you are, how you carry yourself, what you will and will not accept, and the quiet but absolute certainty you project about your own worth. It cannot be earned through performance. It cannot be begged into existence. It cannot be argued or explained or cried into someone who has already decided, consciously or not, that you are someone they don't have to take seriously. It can only be commanded, and commanding it requires something most people are terrified to do. It requires you to act like someone who deserves it before anyone has confirmed that you do. Walk like it. Speak like it. Make decisions like it. Draw lines like it. Walk away from things like it, not dramatically, not for audience, but with the quiet, devastatingly calm energy of someone who simply knows that what they're walking away from is beneath what they're building. Machiavelli, in all his studied ruthlessness, understood that the most powerful force in any human dynamic is not strength of body or sharpness of mind. It is the unshakable conviction a person carries about their own value. He observed, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. Look at what you've allowed around you. Look at the relationships you've maintained out of habit or fear, or the quiet hope that things would eventually change. Look at the spaces you've stayed in, past the point of dignity. That is your autobiography. Written not in words, but in the tolerance you extended and the standards you dropped, and the version of yourself you suppressed to survive environments that were never worthy of you. Respect begins the moment you rewrite that autobiography, not by announcing it, not by posting about it, not by telling people you've changed, but by simply, irrevocably, being different, by being the person who no longer flinches, who no longer chases, who no longer dims their light so others can pretend they don't see it, by becoming someone so deeply, quietly, powerfully themselves that the world has no choice but to reorganize around that fact. That is the dark power of respect. And it has been inside you this entire time, waiting not for permission, but for you to finally stop apologizing for it. So, here we are. 6 truths, 6 mirrors, 6 moments that maybe, somewhere in the middle of watching this, felt less like information and more like memory, like something you already knew but had been too afraid to say out loud. Because that's the thing about truth when it's real. It doesn't feel new. It feels like returning, like walking back into a version of yourself that existed before the world taught you to make yourself convenient. You were never the problem. Your softness was never the problem. Your depth was never the problem. The way you loved people with everything you had, that was never the weakness they made you feel it was. The problem was the absence of the one thing that protects all of those beautiful qualities from being used against you. Boundaries, standards, the unshakable knowledge of what you deserve, and the willingness to walk away from anything that falls short of it. Machiavelli spent his life studying power not because he was heartless, but because he understood something sacred. That a person without power over their own life, their own narrative, their own worth, is a person living entirely at the mercy of others. And mercy, as history has shown, is the most unreliable currency there is. You don't need everyone to like you. You need to like yourself enough that their opinion stops being the thing you organize your entire existence around. Stop performing. Stop shrinking. Stop swallowing your truth to make someone else's comfort more important than your own dignity. Start being the person that even you, in your most honest, private, unguarded moment, would look at and think, that person knows exactly who they are. Because that person, that version of you, that is someone the world will never be able to ignore, and that is someone you've always had the power to become. You just had to stop being liked first. Drop this in the comments. I rise in respect.